Today, I want to spend a few minutes with you talking about athletic recruiting and what craziness that can add to an already tumultuous at times process. If you are the parent or an adult who is working with a young person who is athletic and has a desire to pursue athletics at the collegiate level, then hopefully there will be a couple of tidbits of information here that are helpful for you. The first thing to point out is that recruiting looks different for every sport. There are a variety of ways in which students can be identified in this process, but it does depend upon the sport that they play. So certain obvious examples might be travel baseball or club soccer or club lacrosse or field hockey, teams that are regularly traveling to play in tournaments or showcases where college recruiters and coaches are going to be present so that they are seen and they are participating in front of this group of people, whoever they might actually be from the college side that would be there. Other sports, high school football, for example, they're not necessarily traveling to play in tournaments like that. Their recruiting process is going to look a little bit different in terms of how players are identified by the college programs. They, for example, rely heavily on the use of X, formerly known as Twitter. The athletes are putting out their information there for them to be found. And that is what my experience was as the parent of a recruited athlete who played football specifically. He was, not we, very active on X and making sure that his information was out there for coaches to see. But the other thing that's really important, no matter what the sport is that you as a family, and especially the student athlete, is talking directly to their coaches who are coaching them currently about how to navigate this part of the process. So I tell students and families who are going through athletic recruiting that when you're doing that, your college search and admission process is essentially going to involve two pillars. You're going to have the schools where you are interested in attending, whether you were recruited or not. You are saying, I would apply there, and if I didn't get to play baseball there, I would be fine. I'd be happy to be a student there. That kind of list. That list really is developed the same way we would develop anybody else's list for colleges, looking at the right fit academically, socially, financially, all of those kinds of things. Then there's this other list, which is where you can be a competitive athlete and be potentially recruited to play by a college or university. That list may vary because your talents and abilities as an athlete might be different than your talents and abilities as a student. What we're hoping for is that somewhere in there's some crossover and that there's an alignment with both your academics and athletic abilities. But with the athletic side of it in particular, here are some important questions that I ask students to think about when they're beginning this part of the process, looking at athletic recruiting. First and foremost, do you just want to be on a team, or do you want to go somewhere where you know you can play right away? I think that is one of the biggest factors that students need to consider in this process, because oftentimes we are working with students who are strong athletes in high school, clearly, if they're thinking that they might even be able to play at the next level. So going from being a starter or at least having a lot of playing time may be something that is hard for someone who is then saying, well, look, I'm being recruited by this amazing program, but I know I'm going to have to sit out for the first year or whatever the case may be. So thinking about that, I think, is really, really important. Thinking about just the commitment levels, that it is different to play Division I level sports than it is to be a high school athlete. It is very much I'll call it a job for lack of a better term, or especially if you are a scholarship athlete in a revenue generating sport, especially, those are football, men's basketball typically, but some others that we sort of differentiate between revenue sports and then what we call the Olympic sports. But if you're in a revenue sport, you're going to be very committed to a schedule that includes your workouts, your nutrition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Don't forget practice and then games and travel. But it is important that you're thinking about that. Could alter, in fact, I would argue that it in fact will alter the overall college experience. It is just different to be a Division I athlete than to be a typical college student who's involved in other areas of academics and extracurricular life. So keeping that in mind, are you committed to that? But also thinking about, okay, that's Division I, revenue sports especially. What about playing at the Division II or Division III level? You may find that that's a better fit as an athlete if you're not committed to being so all in that your whole lifestyle revolves around the sport. So Division III I'll talk about mainly because I was a Division III athlete and that was a lived experience for me. In my case, I ran cross country at a Division III college, and it was basically just another fun activity to do. We were competitive and we worked out and we had fun in season and enjoyed going to our meets and things like that, but it didn't take up massive amounts of time. In fact, it would have been similar to what my commitment would have been like on the high school team. So thinking about that, again, that balance of how much time and commitment do athletes want to have in this process. And then also thinking about looking at the school as a whole. So you're being recruited. Again, I talked earlier about the two different columns of schools that we're looking at, places where you might apply, whether you were recruited or not, and then the places where you're being recruited. The bottom line is, even at the places where you're being recruited, you need to know that you would like being a student at that school. Again, even if your experience is different than what we'll call a traditional student on campus, you need to be sure that you would be fitting in there academically, socially, etc., because if something catastrophic were to happen and you were not able to play sports anymore, would you be okay being at that school? And I think that's a really important factor for students to think about, because it does happen. Knock on wood, it doesn't happen often, and I don't wish that on anybody, but if something does happen and you need to make a change, are you going to be comfortable being a student there at that particular school? For the purpose of this conversation today, I do not have the time or energy to address the transfer portal and what that has done to college athletics, maybe for another recording down the road. But again, 3 key points that I want families and their students to be thinking about if they're considering recruitment. Making sure they understand where they feel like they want to be in the pecking order of the team. Do they want to get in and play right away? Are they comfortable sitting? What about the right fit in terms of their lifestyle? Is it Division I, II, or III? What makes the most sense in terms of that? Not to mention, that's got to align with their overall talent, because just because you might want to play Division I ball doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be recruited to do so. But keeping that in mind, understanding where you fall in terms of the overall divisions that would be best suited for you. And then thinking about liking the school enough so that you are sure that you would be happy being there even if something changed in your circumstances related to athletics. This is just a small scratch of the surface. There's so many other layers to recruiting and the timeline. The NCAA itself has some really great resources that outline, especially the timeline for recruiting, explaining when coaches can make contact, when are dead periods and things like that, just so if you're embarking on this as a family, you kind of understand perhaps when to expect communications to take place and things like that. And again, just reiterating this really important fact, a conversation with current coaches is really valuable to have in this process to better understand where do they see you fitting in at the collegiate level, and letting them know that you're interested so that they can help you with this recruiting process. Getting your name out there and being noticed by coaches is going to be a very important part of making sure that you have some athletic offers in this process. So lots of layers to this. I'm happy to discuss it. Like I said, I went through it as a parent myself. I was also a coach at the high school level for a while, so saw students being recruited from that perspective. And I'm happy to have conversations about it if I can be of any assistance. Take care.